Human history is usually presented as a straight line. A simple progression from early humans, to tools, to agriculture, to cities, and finally to modern technology. In this story, we are the first intelligent civilization to rise on Earth, and everything before us was primitive and temporary. But what if that story is incomplete? What if human civilization is not the first advanced society this planet has ever supported? This idea is uncomfortable, and that's exactly why it's rarely discussed. It challenges one of our deepest assumptions, that we are unique in Earth's history, standing at the very beginning of intelligence and technological progress. To understand why this question matters, we need to think about time differently. Not human time measured in decades or centuries, but geological time measured in tens of thousands and millions of years. Compared to the age of the Earth, recorded human history is almost nothing. Writing only goes back a few thousand years. Even the oldest known ruins represent a tiny fraction of the planet's timeline. Civilization feels permanent to us because we live inside it. Cities feel solid. Technology feels enduring. But in reality, civilization is extremely fragile. If modern humans disappeared today, nature would reclaim our cities faster than most people realize. Buildings would collapse, metal would rust, concrete would break apart, and within a relatively short period, very little would remain on the surface. Given enough time, even the most advanced civilization can be erased almost completely. This leads to an important question. If a civilization existed long before us, how would we know? What kind of evidence would survive tens or hundreds of thousands of years? We tend to imagine obvious ruins, intact structures, or advanced machines waiting to be discovered. But that expectation may be unrealistic. Time does not preserve cities. It grinds them down, buries them, and eventually turns them into geology. The Earth itself is constantly recycling its surface. Continents shift. Oceans rise and fall. Ice ages reshape the land. Entire landscapes are erased and rebuilt. In this process, anything that once existed on the surface can be destroyed or hidden far beyond easy discovery. This means the absence of obvious evidence does not automatically mean the absence of a past civilization. It may simply mean that we are looking for the wrong kind of evidence, or that we expect the past to survive in forms that time does not allow. Some researchers have begun asking a quiet but serious question: instead of looking for ruins, what if we should be looking for anomalies? Unusual patterns in geology. Chemical signatures that don't match natural processes. Artifacts that don't fit comfortably into the timeline we've constructed. Individually, these anomalies are often dismissed. A strange object is explained away. An unusual layer of sediment is called a coincidence. An ancient map or story is labeled a myth. But when many of these anomalies appear across different fields and different parts of the world, they begin to raise deeper questions. Another important factor is memory. Human memory does not scale well over deep time. Stories change. Myths form. Facts become symbols. Over thousands of years, real events can be transformed into legends, stripped of their original context but still carrying fragments of truth. Floods, sky beings, lost golden ages, these stories appear across cultures that had no contact with each other. The mainstream view is that these are symbolic or psychological in origin. But an alternative possibility exists, that some myths are distorted memories of real events, passed down in simplified form after their original meaning was lost. If Earth has hosted advanced societies before, the most unsettling implication is not that they existed, but that they disappeared. That civilization may not be a permanent achievement, but a temporary phase. Something that rises, peaks, and collapses, leaving behind only faint traces that future societies struggle to recognize. If this is true, then history as we understand it is missing entire chapters. Humanity would not be the first to shape the planet, only the most recent. And the question would no longer be whether civilization can collapse, but how often it already has. By the end of this video, you may begin to see human history less as a straight line and more as a cycle. A repeating pattern of rise, achievement, and disappearance. And once that idea takes hold, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because if a civilization existed before us and was erased by time, then the most important question is not what happened to them, but whether the same forces are already at work today. If you're fascinated by hidden histories and the mysteries our planet might be hiding, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dives. And if you're enjoying this journey so far, like the video and share it. Let others explore these questions with you. One of the biggest mistakes we make when thinking about civilization is assuming that it is durable. We live surrounded by concrete, steel, glass, and digital systems, so it feels permanent. Cities look solid. Infrastructure looks unstoppable. Technology feels like something that has escaped the limits of nature. But civilization is far more fragile than it appears. To understand this, imagine a simple thought experiment. Suppose modern humans disappeared today. No war. No explosion. Just sudden absence. What would happen to the world we leave behind? Within days, power plants would shut down. Without maintenance, electrical grids would fail. Water systems would collapse. Elevators would stop. Nuclear facilities, designed to be constantly managed, would begin to break down. Within years, bridges would weaken, roads would crack, and cities would start to collapse under their own weight. Plants would grow through asphalt. Trees would split buildings apart. Rivers would change course once dams failed. Wildlife would return rapidly, not slowly. Nature would not struggle to reclaim the world. It would rush in. Within a few centuries, most surface structures would be gone. Steel rusts. Concrete crumbles. Glass shatters and disappears into sediment. Skyscrapers, no matter how impressive, are not designed to survive thousands of years without care. By 10,000 years, the timeline of civilization becomes almost unrecognizable. At that point, nearly everything we associate with modern life would be erased from the surface of the planet. Our cities would no longer look like cities. They would be hills, rubble fields, or forests with unusual stone distributions beneath them. Even iconic landmarks would be gone, reduced to fragments buried underground. This raises an uncomfortable reality. Civilization does not leave behind clean, obvious evidence of its existence. It leaves behind broken pieces, scattered traces, and subtle signatures that blend into the natural world over time. So what actually survives deep time? Stone survives. Not buildings, but worked stone. Foundations, tunnels, quarries, and large-scale earthworks have a better chance of lasting because they become part of the landscape itself. Even then, erosion slowly reshapes them until they look natural. Certain materials also leave chemical signatures. Industrial activity changes the composition of the atmosphere, the soil, and the oceans. These changes can become trapped in ice cores, sediments, and rock layers. They don't look like artifacts, but they are scars written into the planet. There are also isotopes, specific atomic signatures that can indicate unusual energy use, large-scale industry, or sudden environmental change. These signals don't announce themselves as civilization. They appear as anomalies that only make sense if something disrupted natural systems in a short period of time. But here's the key problem. We are not trained to interpret these signs as evidence of intelligence. We are trained to interpret them as natural events. This matters because future observers, whether human or not, would face the same problem when looking back at us. Imagine a civilization evolving 100,000 years from now. They dig into the ground and study Earth's past. They find strange layers of plastic-like material fused into rock. They detect unusual spikes in carbon levels. They see evidence of rapid climate change followed by recovery. But they find no intact cities. No readable records. No clear monuments. Would they conclude that a global technological civilization once existed? Or would they label these findings as an unusual natural anomaly? It's entirely possible they would never know we were here. This perspective changes how we think about the past. When we say there is no evidence of a prior civilization, what we often mean is that there is no evidence we know how to recognize. Our expectations are shaped by movies and modern ruins. We expect visible remains. We expect clear continuity. But deep time doesn't work that way. This idea is explored in what scientists sometimes call the Silurian hypothesis. Despite the name, it has nothing to do with reptiles or science fiction. It's a serious thought experiment. If an industrial civilization existed millions of years before humans, would we even be able to detect it today? The unsettling answer is maybe not. The hypothesis suggests that after enough time, nearly all direct evidence of civilization would be erased. What remains would be indirect: chemical changes, unusual sediment layers, abrupt climate shifts, and subtle patterns that could easily be explained away as natural. This doesn't mean such a civilization definitely existed. It means that the absence of obvious evidence is not strong proof that it didn't. And that realization opens the door to a much larger question. If civilization is this easy to erase, then Earth's past could contain more stories than we realize. Entire experiments in intelligence may have risen and fallen without leaving anything we would immediately recognize as technological. The planet may have already hosted civilizations that reached complexity, industry, and global influence, only to vanish long before humans began writing history. Later in this video, we will examine specific evidence that suggests this may not be just a theoretical idea. Patterns in geology, artifacts that resist easy explanation, and global myths that hint at lost chapters in Earth's story. For now, the important takeaway is simple and unsettling: civilization is not permanent. It is temporary. And if that is true, then being first matters far less than being aware of what came before. Because the most dangerous assumption a civilization can make is believing it has no predecessors. When people look at Earth's history, it often feels complete. Textbooks present a clear timeline: early life, simple tools, gradual progress, and finally modern civilization. But this sense of completeness is largely an illusion. What we call history occupies an extremely narrow slice of time, surrounded by vast stretches we barely understand. Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Complex life has existed for hundreds of millions of years. Yet human civilization, as we define it, appears almost instantly near the very end of the timeline. When this is drawn on a scale, civilization occupies less than a hair's width at the edge of Earth's history. The problem is not that nothing happened before us. The problem is that geological time compresses information in ways that make long periods look empty. In geology, millions of years can be represented by a thin layer of rock. Entire eras can be missing due to erosion, subduction, or simple non-deposition. When we drill into the Earth, we are not reading a continuous book. We are reading a damaged manuscript with missing pages, torn sections, and entire chapters erased. This creates the false impression that long periods of time were uneventful. In reality, they are simply poorly preserved. When we look at human history, the same pattern appears. For tens of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans existed with relatively simple tools. Then, suddenly, we see rapid change. Agriculture emerges. Cities appear. Writing develops. Technology accelerates. Within a few thousand years, humans move from stone tools to complex societies. This jump feels abrupt, almost unnatural. The standard explanation is that population growth, climate stability, and social complexity reached a tipping point. And that explanation may be correct. But it doesn't address a deeper question: why does progress appear to stall for so long, then explode so quickly? In biology, we see a similar pattern. Long periods of stability interrupted by sudden bursts of complexity. This is known as punctuated equilibrium. Species appear to change very little for millions of years, then rapidly diversify. While this is well accepted in evolutionary theory, its implications for civilization are rarely discussed. If intelligence and technological capability follow similar patterns, then long periods of apparent stagnation may hide underlying development that simply doesn't fossilize well. Tools made of wood, fibers, or early composites would not survive. Settlements built near coastlines would be swallowed by rising seas. Early infrastructure could be erased long before it ever becomes visible to archaeology. This brings us to an important realization: civilizations do not need millions of years to rise and fall. They only need to exist earlier than our records can reach. A civilization that existed 50,000 or even 100,000 years ago would be almost completely invisible today. Sea levels were lower then. Coastlines were different. Many areas where early civilizations would naturally settle are now underwater or buried beneath sediment. When we search for precursors to civilization, we often expect a slow, obvious buildup: simple cities becoming larger, tools becoming gradually more advanced, technology progressing step by step. But that expectation may be unrealistic. Technological progress does not have to be linear. Knowledge can be lost. Societies can collapse. Skills can disappear. A civilization can reach a certain level, fall, and leave behind only fragments that later cultures misinterpret or reuse without understanding. This could explain why history feels reset. Each time civilization collapses, the next one does not start from zero, but it also does not inherit everything. It begins with partial knowledge, scattered myths, and repurposed ruins. Over time, these fragments lose their original context. The absence of gradual precursors may not mean civilization appeared from nothing. It may mean that earlier attempts were erased so thoroughly that we mistake their remnants for natural formations or primitive activity. Another factor is how modern archaeology works. Archaeology is excellent at identifying stone tools, bones, and ceramics. It is far less effective at detecting early industry, temporary settlements, or materials that degrade quickly. What we can find shapes what we believe existed. This creates a selection bias. We see what survives, and we assume that what survives is all that mattered. But imagine applying this method to our own civilization far in the future. Without metal, electronics, plastics, or readable records, future researchers might see only scattered stone structures and assume we were far less advanced than we actually are. The timeline would look incomplete. Progress would appear sudden and unearned. At this point, the question becomes unavoidable. Why does Earth's history look like it keeps starting over? Why do we see repeated resets, extinctions, and rapid recoveries, but no long, continuous chain of technological development. One explanation is that civilization is incredibly rare and fragile, and we are simply lucky. Another explanation is that civilization emerges more often than we think, but rarely lasts long enough to leave a clear trace. And that leads to a more unsettling possibility. What if the evidence of earlier civilizations already exists, scattered across geology, artifacts, and myths, but we have been trained to interpret it as something else? What if the problem is not the absence of evidence, but the way we define it? In the next section, we will look at objects and structures that don't fit comfortably into the official timeline. Items that appear too advanced, too precise, or too misplaced for the era they are assigned to. Because once you begin to question the timeline itself, some discoveries become very difficult to ignore. When people imagine evidence of a lost civilization, they often picture dramatic discoveries, advanced machines, intact buildings, or unmistakable technology frozen in time. But that expectation misunderstands how evidence survives. What usually remains are not clear answers, but uncomfortable questions. Across the world, there are objects, structures, and documents that don't fit neatly into the historical periods assigned to them. These are often referred to as out-of-place artifacts, or OOPArts. The term itself is controversial, and it's important to be clear about what it does and does not mean. OOPArts are not proof of a lost advanced civilization. They are anomalies, items or constructions that appear unusual for their time, location, or supposed technological context. Most are dismissed, some are misunderstood, and a few resist easy explanation. Individually, each case can be explained away. But when similar anomalies appear across different regions and cultures, patterns begin to emerge. One of the most discussed categories is precision stonework. In multiple ancient sites around the world, we find stone blocks cut with extreme accuracy. Not just roughly shaped, but fitted together so tightly that even thin blades cannot pass between them. In some cases, these stones weigh tens or even hundreds of tons, yet they are placed with remarkable precision. The conventional explanation is that ancient builders used simple tools, patience, and large labor forces. And in many cases, that explanation is sufficient. Humans are capable of extraordinary feats with limited technology. However, some features raise difficult questions. At certain sites, the stone appears to have been cut in ways that resemble machining rather than chipping. Surfaces are smooth, angles are consistent, and curves are repeated with precision that would be extremely difficult to achieve using basic stone or copper tools alone. Again, this does not mean advanced machinery was used. But it does suggest that either ancient techniques were more sophisticated than we currently understand, or that some aspects of these sites are being underestimated. Another category involves marks that resemble machining patterns. Parallel grooves, circular cuts, and uniform drill holes appear in hard stone at sites separated by vast distances. In some cases, these marks show consistency that suggests controlled processes rather than random manual effort. Mainstream explanations exist for many of these features, including abrasion, repeated motion, and lost techniques. The issue is not that explanations are impossible. The issue is that the same types of anomalies appear repeatedly, across cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another. This repetition is where interest deepens. If these were isolated mistakes or misinterpretations, they would be rare and inconsistent. Instead, we see similar questions arising in South America, the Middle East, Asia, and parts of Africa. Different cultures, different eras, similar unexplained features. Maps present another category of anomaly. Several ancient maps depict geographic features with surprising accuracy. Some show coastlines that appear to match submerged landforms. Others suggest knowledge of regions that were supposedly unknown at the time the maps were created. One of the most debated examples involves maps that appear to show Antarctica without ice. The mainstream explanation is that these maps are compilations, copies of copies, derived from multiple sources, some of which may have been misinterpreted. That explanation may be correct. But it still raises a question: where did the original source data come from? And why does it sometimes appear more accurate than expected for its time? Once again, the issue is not proof. It is pattern. Artifacts that don't quite fit. Knowledge that seems oddly placed. Precision that appears earlier than expected. Each case alone is weak. Together, they form a persistent discomfort in the timeline. Critics are correct to warn against jumping to conclusions. History is full of exaggerated claims, misunderstandings, and outright fabrications. Skepticism is necessary. Without it, speculation quickly becomes fantasy. But skepticism cuts both ways. Dismissing every anomaly as coincidence or error can also blind us to legitimate questions. Science advances not by ignoring inconsistencies, but by examining them carefully. What makes these artifacts interesting is not that they prove anything, but that they resist being fully explained within a simple linear model of history. They suggest that ancient societies may have had access to knowledge, techniques, or organizational abilities that we have not fully reconstructed. They also suggest that our picture of technological development may be incomplete. And even if none of these artifacts point to a global advanced civilization, they still challenge the idea that the past was uniformly primitive and simple. At minimum, they tell us that ancient humans were more capable, more inventive, and more complex than we often give them credit for. At maximum, they raise a more provocative possibility, that fragments of earlier knowledge may have survived through collapse, reused and misunderstood by later cultures. And this is where caution is most important. Artifacts can be misdated. Sites can be misinterpreted. Context can be lost. We must resist the temptation to force conclusions where evidence is incomplete. But we must also resist the temptation to ignore recurring questions simply because they are uncomfortable. Because artifacts, no matter how strange, are only half the story. Objects can be moved. Structures can be reused. Knowledge can be copied without understanding. If something truly shaped Earth on a global scale, the strongest evidence would not be found in a single object or site. It would be written into the planet itself. In the next section, we will shift our focus away from artifacts and toward the Earth's own memory, geological signatures, chemical traces, and planetary changes that may tell a deeper story. Because if a civilization existed before us, the Earth may remember what history forgot. So far, we've focused on artifacts, objects, structures, and maps that raise questions about the past. But artifacts have limitations. They can be moved, reused, misdated, or misunderstood. A stone block might be repurposed by later cultures. A map might be copied without knowing its original source. If something truly shaped Earth on a large scale, the strongest evidence would not come from a single object. It would come from the planet itself. The Earth records its history in layers. Ice cores, sediment, rock formations, and chemical signatures preserve information over enormous spans of time. Unlike human records, these systems don't forget intentionally. They simply record what happens, then move on. This makes geology one of the most powerful tools for investigating deep history. One area of interest involves unusual isotope ratios. Isotopes are variations of elements that behave in predictable ways under natural conditions. When those patterns change suddenly or appear out of place, scientists take notice. Certain industrial processes, large-scale energy use, and rapid environmental disruption can leave distinct isotopic signatures. These signals don't announce themselves as artificial. They simply appear as anomalies, numbers that don't quite match expectations. In Earth's deep past, scientists have identified moments where isotope ratios shift rapidly and globally. In many cases, these shifts are attributed to volcanic activity, asteroid impacts, or natural climate cycles. These explanations are often reasonable and well supported. However, the existence of alternative explanations raises an important question. If an industrial civilization existed long ago, would its isotopic signatures look fundamentally different from natural events? Or would they blend into the background, interpreted as another unusual but natural occurrence? This is not speculation about secret technologies or advanced machines. It's a question about detectability. Could industrial activity mimic natural processes closely enough that we fail to recognize it? Sediment layers raise similar questions. Throughout Earth's history, there are thin layers of material that mark sudden changes, abrupt extinctions, rapid warming events, or chemical shifts in the oceans. These layers often represent moments of crisis, where something disrupted global systems faster than usual. Again, natural explanations dominate. Massive volcanic eruptions, methane releases, changes in ocean circulation. These events do happen, and they leave clear marks in the geological record. But what makes some of these layers interesting is not just that they exist, but how quickly they appear and how globally synchronized they are. Rapid change across multiple systems suggests a powerful trigger. This leads to an uncomfortable overlap. Large-scale industrial activity, especially if unregulated or poorly understood, can also cause rapid, global environmental shifts. Atmospheric composition changes. Ocean chemistry shifts. Climate destabilizes. This does not mean ancient industry caused these events. But it does mean that, in principle, the geological fingerprints of civilization and certain natural disasters may not be easily distinguishable after millions of years. Climate disruptions in deep time provide another angle. Earth has experienced dramatic climate changes long before humans. Ice ages come and go. Temperatures rise and fall. Life adapts or disappears. These patterns are well studied. But some transitions are unusually abrupt. They occur faster than typical natural cycles would suggest. When this happens, scientists search for causes, often finding reasonable explanations. The question raised by the Silurian hypothesis is not whether natural explanations exist, but whether they are the only explanations we consider. If a prior civilization altered the atmosphere, oceans, or biosphere on a global scale, those changes would eventually stabilize. Life would recover. The planet would move on. Millions of years later, the event might look like just another strange spike in Earth's long history. One of the most sensitive topics in this discussion involves so-called nuclear-like signatures. This idea is often misunderstood, so it's important to be precise. No one is suggesting ancient nuclear reactors or weapons in the distant past. What researchers sometimes discuss are isotopic patterns that resemble high-energy processes. These patterns can arise naturally under certain conditions, including radioactive decay, natural fission reactions, and extreme geological environments. The existence of such signatures does not imply technology. But it raises a methodological question: if advanced energy use occurred long ago, would we even know the difference today? In fact, we already know that natural nuclear reactions have occurred in Earth's past. The Oklo natural reactors in Africa demonstrate that conditions can align to produce nuclear fission without human intervention. This fact alone shows that high-energy signatures are not exclusive to modern technology, which complicates things further. If nature itself can produce signals we associate with advanced processes, then distinguishing between natural and artificial causes in deep time becomes extremely difficult. At this point, it's important to step back and restate the central mystery, especially for anyone joining the discussion now. The question is not whether we have proof of a lost advanced civilization. We do not. The question is whether Earth's record is capable of preserving clear proof at all. If civilization is fragile, if time erases surface evidence, and if planetary systems absorb and smooth out disruptions, then the absence of obvious signs may tell us very little. What we are left with are patterns. Repeated resets. Sudden changes. Anomalies that fit comfortably within natural explanations, yet leave just enough room for doubt. The shift here is subtle but important. Instead of asking, "Where are the ruins?" we begin asking, "What kind of evidence would realistically survive?" And once that question is asked honestly, the past starts to look less empty than it once did. In the next section, we'll move away from rocks and chemistry and turn to something more human, stories. Because even when stone erodes and isotopes fade, memory sometimes survives in unexpected ways. And if Earth remembers through geology, humanity may remember through myth. So far, we've looked at physical evidence, artifacts, geology, and planetary systems. But there is another kind of record that survives where stone and metal fail: stories. Human memory does not preserve events accurately over long periods of time, but it does preserve meaning. When facts are lost, narratives remain. Every civilization tells stories about its origins. And when these stories are compared across cultures that never met, something strange begins to appear. The details differ, but the structure is often the same. One of the most widespread examples is the flood myth. From Mesopotamia to India, from the Americas to Africa, cultures describe a great flood that wiped out a previous world. Humanity survives only through a few chosen individuals. Knowledge is lost. Civilization must begin again. The mainstream explanation is that floods are common natural disasters, and societies near rivers and coastlines would naturally create stories about them. This explanation makes sense. Floods shape human experience. But it doesn't fully explain the consistency. These stories often describe not just flooding, but a complete reset of the world. A time before the flood that was more advanced, more ordered, or closer to the gods. A catastrophic event. Then a diminished age that follows. What's interesting is not whether the floods literally happened as described, but why so many cultures independently frame their past in the same way: an advanced earlier time, followed by destruction, followed by rebuilding. Another recurring theme involves sky gods, or civilizing figures. These beings are often described as arriving after a catastrophe. They bring knowledge, agriculture, architecture, law, astronomy, mathematics. They teach humans how to rebuild society. Importantly, this knowledge is not described as developing gradually. It arrives suddenly. In many myths, humans are portrayed as incapable or chaotic until these figures intervene. Afterward, civilization appears almost fully formed. Cities rise. Calendars are established. Writing begins. Social order takes shape. Modern interpretations often label these figures as gods, aliens, or purely symbolic archetypes. But another possibility exists, that these stories are distorted accounts of knowledge transfer after collapse. If a civilization fell, survivors would not pass on advanced science in technical terms. They would pass on fragments, rules, rituals, symbols, stories. Over generations, practical knowledge becomes sacred tradition. Teachers become gods. History becomes myth. Shared symbols reinforce this idea. Across disconnected cultures, we find similar imagery: serpents associated with knowledge, stepped pyramids, sacred mountains, sky ladders, world trees, and cycles of ages. These symbols appear in places with no known contact, separated by oceans and thousands of years. The common explanation is that human psychology produces similar symbols everywhere. And again, that explanation has merit. But there is a competing question. Why do these symbols so often align with themes of loss, punishment, and rebuilding? Why do so many traditions warn of repeating cycles rather than permanent progress? Another striking pattern is how myths treat technology and knowledge. Advanced skills are often portrayed as dangerous or forbidden. Fire, metalworking, astronomy, writing, these gifts frequently come with consequences. They provoke disaster, anger the gods, or destabilize the world. This framing is strange if knowledge is simply a natural human achievement. But it makes more sense if knowledge is remembered as something that once went too far. Myths rarely celebrate endless progress. They warn about it. This brings us to the central question of this section: are myths fiction, or are they compressed history? Over long spans of time, factual detail doesn't survive. Dates disappear. Locations shift. Names change. What remains is structure, sequence, emotional weight. If ancient people experienced a catastrophic collapse of civilization, they would not remember it as an economic failure or environmental miscalculation. They would remember fear, loss, confusion, the sense that the world had ended. And that emotional imprint would be passed down. Stories persist because they matter. Cultures do not preserve narratives for thousands of years unless those narratives serve a purpose. Flood myths, lost golden ages, forbidden knowledge, and civilizing teachers appear again and again because they explain something that felt impossible to forget. Not because people understood it fully, but because it terrified them enough to remember. This doesn't mean myths are literal records of advanced technology or lost civilizations. But it does suggest they may contain echoes of real events filtered through generations of retelling. When myths from different cultures point in the same direction, toward collapse, reset, and inherited knowledge, it raises a quiet but persistent question. What if these stories are not about imagination, but about survival? What if humanity has lived through collapse before, and myths are the last distorted traces of those experiences? If that's the case, then myths are not evidence in the scientific sense. But they are signals. Emotional fossils of something that left a deep mark on the human story. And that leads to a difficult realization. If earlier civilizations collapsed and left behind only fragments of memory, then forgetting may not be an accident. It may be part of the cycle. In the next section, we'll explore why ideas like this remain controversial, uncomfortable, and often dismissed. Not because they are proven false, but because of what they would mean for how we understand progress, authority, and our place in history. Because sometimes, what is labeled forbidden is not dangerous because it is wrong, but because it is destabilizing. At this point, a reasonable question emerges. If the idea of earlier civilizations is even remotely plausible, why isn't it discussed more openly? Why does it sit at the edges of academic conversation, treated as speculation rather than inquiry? The answer is less dramatic than many people expect. It doesn't require secret meetings or deliberate cover-ups. In most cases, it comes down to comfort, structure, and incentives. Modern academia is built on stability. Knowledge advances by building on what already exists. Careers, funding, and reputations depend on working within established frameworks. When a theory fits comfortably inside the accepted timeline, it can be tested, debated, and refined. When a theory challenges the foundation of that timeline, it becomes much harder to place. Speculative history is not rejected because it is dangerous. It is rejected because it is difficult to manage. Academic disciplines rely on boundaries. Archaeology studies material remains. Geology studies earth processes. Anthropology studies culture. Ideas that cross these boundaries create problems. A hypothesis about a pre-human civilization touches all of them at once, without fitting neatly into any. That alone is enough to make it unpopular. Funding plays a major role as well. Research requires resources, and resources are limited. Grant committees tend to support projects with clear methods, predictable outcomes, and minimal risk to established understanding. A proposal to search for indirect evidence of an ancient industrial civilization does not promise clear results. It promises controversy, ambiguity, and criticism. From an institutional perspective, that is not attractive. Reputation also matters. Scientists and historians are trained to be cautious for good reason. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that principle protects scholarship from error and exaggeration. But it can also create an environment where certain questions are never asked, because asking them carries professional risk. Suggesting that civilization may not be unique to our era can sound, to some, like undermining centuries of historical work. Even if framed carefully, it invites misunderstanding. No one wants their research associated with sensationalism, even when the question itself is legitimate. There is also a psychological factor that goes beyond institutions. Humans are deeply attached to origin stories. We like beginnings. We like firsts. Being the first civilization matters because it gives meaning to progress. It reinforces the idea that humanity is on an upward trajectory, moving from ignorance to enlightenment. The possibility that we are not the first challenges that narrative. If civilization has risen and fallen before, then progress is not guaranteed. Advancement becomes temporary rather than permanent. Knowledge becomes fragile. Achievement becomes reversible. That idea is deeply unsettling. Civilization pride plays a role here. Modern society defines itself through technology, science, and control over nature. These achievements feel unprecedented. They support the belief that we have finally escaped the cycles that trapped earlier humans. The idea that others may have reached similar heights, and failed, undermines that confidence. It suggests that intelligence alone is not enough. That innovation does not equal wisdom. That progress may carry its own limits. This is why discussions about lost civilizations often trigger defensive reactions. Not because the evidence is overwhelming, but because the implication is uncomfortable. Another reason these ideas remain marginalized is that they don't offer clean conclusions. They don't lead to a single discovery or a clear rewrite of history. Instead, they introduce uncertainty. They blur boundaries. They raise questions that may never be fully answered. Science prefers problems it can eventually solve. The deep past resists that preference. This does not mean skepticism is wrong. Skepticism is essential. Many claims about ancient advanced civilizations are exaggerated or unsupported. Healthy criticism protects knowledge from drifting into fantasy. But skepticism becomes a problem when it hardens into dismissal. When anomalies are ignored rather than investigated. When patterns are rejected rather than examined. When questions are labeled unscientific simply because they don't fit existing models. At this point, it's important to make one thing clear. Forbidden doesn't mean fake. It means destabilizing. Ideas become uncomfortable not because they are false, but because they force us to rethink assumptions we rely on. The idea of earlier civilizations destabilizes our sense of uniqueness, progress, and control. It reframes human history not as a triumphant climb, but as a repeating experiment. And that leads to an even more troubling thought. If civilizations can collapse and be forgotten, then forgetting may not be an accident. It may be a feature of the cycle. Each new civilization builds confidence by believing it is unprecedented. Each one assumes it has learned enough to avoid the mistakes of the past. And each one may be wrong. In the next section, we'll turn away from institutions and psychology and focus on outcomes. If earlier civilizations did exist, what could have ended them? And more importantly, do those same forces still exist today? Because understanding why they may have disappeared is inseparable from understanding where we might be headed. If an earlier civilization once existed, the question that naturally follows is, what happened to it? Why did it vanish so completely that only fragments, if any, remain? We can only speculate, and that speculation must be framed carefully. There is no direct proof, only patterns, possibilities, and lessons from both natural history and human behavior. One possibility is climate collapse. The Earth has experienced dramatic shifts, ice ages, extreme warming, sudden sea level changes, and shifts in rainfall patterns. Civilizations dependent on stable environments are particularly vulnerable. Agriculture, urban centers, and trade all rely on predictable conditions. A sudden climate disruption could undermine food systems, destabilize societies, and trigger a cascading collapse. Another scenario is self-inflicted catastrophe. Advanced civilizations carry risks that earlier societies may have faced long before humans understood them fully. Resource depletion, uncontrolled industrial processes, or conflicts on a large scale could destabilize society. Civilizations are fragile precisely because they rely on complex systems. When those systems fail, recovery is slow and difficult. Natural extinction cycles provide a third explanation. Life on Earth has repeatedly undergone mass extinctions. Species, ecosystems, and even dominant groups rise and fall according to forces that operate on geological timescales. A civilization could be erased simply because it existed during a period of environmental stress beyond its control. Solar or cosmic events are another possibility. Massive solar flares, asteroid impacts, or gamma-ray bursts can disrupt the planet globally. Evidence of these events appears in geological records, and they have repeatedly reshaped life on Earth. A civilization could be abruptly wiped out or severely weakened, leaving little trace behind. It is important to stress that none of these scenarios requires mystery or conspiracy. Civilizations are inherently fragile. The factors that threaten society today, climate instability, overuse of resources, global conflict, and exposure to cosmic hazards, would have threatened any advanced society that came before us. This leads to a subtle mirror effect. As we consider what may have ended earlier civilizations, it is impossible not to compare them to ourselves. Modern society is more technologically advanced, but it is also highly interconnected and dependent on fragile systems. A global-scale failure in energy, food, water, or communication could cascade faster than we anticipate. Even without repeating history exactly, the vulnerabilities are similar. Human civilization today faces risks that would have been deadly to earlier societies as well. The difference is that we often imagine ourselves immune because of our knowledge and technology, but survival is never guaranteed. By considering these scenarios, the patterns from the past begin to resonate with the present. Sudden collapse, environmental disruption, and the disappearance of entire systems are not abstract possibilities, they are concrete outcomes observed repeatedly throughout Earth's history. And this is what makes the question of prior civilizations so compelling. It is not merely about the past. It is about recognizing that intelligence and advancement alone do not secure permanence. Even the most capable civilization can vanish if conditions shift too rapidly or systems fail. Ultimately, we cannot know with certainty why a hypothetical earlier civilization disappeared. We can only observe what history allows us to infer, that collapse is always possible, that evidence can vanish, and that patterns from the distant past may reflect dynamics that remain relevant today. This understanding prepares us for the next question: if civilizations are fragile and easily erased, what traces could possibly survive in ways we might recognize, or fail to recognize, millions of years later? In the next section, we'll explore the subtle signs in both the planet and human record that may point to past societies, and the implications for our understanding of history and ourselves. If civilizations have risen and fallen before, what does that mean for us? The more we examine the patterns, the harder it becomes to see history as a linear story of progress. Instead, civilization may be more like a repeating experiment, trial and error on a planetary scale, with each iteration leaving fragments, scars, and occasional lessons. One of the key insights from this perspective is that intelligence alone does not guarantee survival. A society can be brilliant, innovative, and technologically advanced, and still be vulnerable to collapse. Complexity creates fragility. Sophisticated infrastructure, global trade, and advanced energy systems are powerful, but they are also interdependent. A failure in one part of the system can ripple outward with catastrophic consequences. This leads to a second lesson: technology without wisdom is not enough. Knowledge can advance faster than our ability to manage it responsibly. Tools are neutral, their consequences depend on the humans who wield them. Societies that mastered energy, agriculture, or engineering may have overreached, destabilizing themselves in ways that left almost no trace. The planet itself plays a role in this cycle. Earth is a reset machine. Geological processes, climate systems, and natural events operate on timescales far beyond human perception. Floods, ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and asteroid impacts occur with regularity. Over millions of years, these forces erase the surface, recycle sediments, and neutralize evidence of past achievements. Civilization, no matter how advanced, exists at the mercy of these systems. The question that emerges is not whether collapse is possible, it is how inevitable it is. If the past teaches anything, it is that no civilization, however capable, is guaranteed to endure indefinitely. At the same time, this perspective is not meant to inspire panic. The point is realization. Observing patterns from the deep past allows us to recognize our vulnerabilities, to understand that history is not a straight line, and to appreciate the fragility of what we often take for granted. By studying anomalies, myths, geological scars, and patterns of collapse, a quiet warning becomes clear. Civilization is temporary. The stability we experience is fragile. Progress is real, but it is also precarious. Understanding this does not require fear. It requires awareness. Awareness that our intelligence is not permanent, that technology can outpace wisdom, and that Earth has reset itself many times before. The past, if it contains traces of earlier civilizations, serves as a mirror. It reflects our strengths, our vulnerabilities, and the choices that determine whether we endure. This reflection is not about destiny. It is about perspective. Recognizing the fragility of civilization allows us to ask better questions about sustainability, resilience, and responsibility. It encourages humility in the face of a planet that has seen it all before. In the final segment, we will close the circle, returning to the question that began this exploration. If Earth did host advanced civilizations before us, what does that mean for history, for humanity, and for the way we understand our place in the story of the planet? If a civilization existed before us, it may have left little behind. No monuments, no records, no clear trace. Only fragments buried in stone, sediment, and story. Only subtle marks in the earth itself, signs that something once shaped the world, now nearly forgotten. We search for answers in artifacts, myths, and isotopes. We look for proof in ruins, in maps, in anomalies. And yet, the most persistent evidence may not be tangible at all. It may be the absence of permanence itself. The knowledge that everything can vanish, no matter how advanced, no matter how intelligent. History is not a straight line. It is a series of cycles, experiments that rise and fall, leaving echoes in geology, memory, and culture. If previous civilizations existed, their story has been mostly erased, but not entirely. And that erasure carries a lesson. Civilization is fragile. Progress is temporary. Intelligence does not equal immortality. What remains is the silence beneath our feet, the empty spaces in time, and the faint memory written in earth itself. If a civilization existed before us, they are not gone. They are the silence beneath our feet. And perhaps the most unsettling question is not what happened to them, but whether we are next in a story the planet has already told. The earth endures. Civilizations do not. Thank you for watching and exploring this journey into the hidden past of our planet. If this video made you think, question, or see history differently, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can join the conversation. Your support helps us dive deeper into mysteries like this, and there's so much more still to uncover.